sorry about that. Okay, so if the ozone didn't get any of the ultraviolet, right? If all the UVA and all the UVB and all the UVC got through, then what would you expect here? The orange curve would be down at the bottom here. There would be 0% absorption. Does everybody see that? Anybody got a question on that? That's super critical. So the orange here, what I've done, and I'm going to overlay something in just a second. The orange shows the absorption by the atmosphere of all the gases in the atmosphere, right? So that's what this little annotation here. The orange is total atmospheric absorption by ozone, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and everything. You can see how poor the atmosphere is absorbing visible light. It only gets about 10% of the visible light down here. And that's the absorption that you see up here in the white, right? So these little vertical spikes that are showing absorption here relate to the little downward white areas here, because remember, that's atmospheric absorption, right? So as we move from left to right across this, it shows how the gases in the atmosphere, and this is the key term, everybody, how the gases in the atmosphere selectively absorb. They are selective absorbers, right? In other words, ozone in the stratosphere does not absorb visible. It doesn't absorb any energy given off by the Earth. It selectively absorbs all of this high energy shortwave ultraviolet radiation. Does that make sense to everybody? Let me just double check if there's any questions on that. All good. Okay. Now let me, so the orange shows the total gases in the atmosphere, right? Now let me overlay two of the critical, the two most important gases in the atmosphere in terms of absorption. So here they come, right? Let me just, my mouse seems to have gone to sleep. The blue shows absorption by water vapor, right? These gray areas here that I've got the arrows on shows absorption by carbon dioxide, right? In other words, when you look at this diagram, everybody, let me just come down here, okay? You can see here that the atmosphere will selectively absorb at increasing percentages and almost up at 100% here at these wavelengths, 1, 1.5, almost 2, 3.5, selectively absorbing energy from the sun. And then look at this, right? Here, water vapor absorbs a chunk of this energy being given off by the Earth, and the same down here. And carbon dioxide is incredibly important right here, okay? Does everybody see that? Really, really important. So what we're looking at here then are these gases in the atmosphere that will selectively absorb at certain wavelengths, right? If there was no water vapor in the atmosphere, not a single drop of water in the atmosphere, then what would this diagram look like? Well, there would certainly be no blue, right? Does that make sense? Okay, got to stop there and make sure everybody's happy with that. Any questions, folks? So what does this mean? Thanks for the thumbs up, Claire. Really good. So what does this mean? What is the importance of the selective absorption, right? What it means is that these gases that selectively absorb radiation, especially the radiation given off by the Earth, leads to a profound effect on climate. And that effect is known as the greenhouse effect, right? That's why we call them greenhouse gases. So this is my attempt to summarize the greenhouse effect, okay? So let's just look at the left-hand side here. And we're going to take these as percentages, right? Not actual individual units. So let's say we've got 100% of the sunlight coming in, 100% of incoming solar radiation, okay? On average for the planet, okay? When we look at that incoming solar radiation, some of that is reflected by the atmosphere, right? Some of that incoming shortwave solar radiation, the sunlight, it bounces off clouds in the atmosphere, and some of it is reflected by the Earth's surface, right? That reflection is known as the albedo, okay, the reflectivity. If any of you are skiers, okay, and end up going to, you know, Aspen or Vail or your favorite ski area. When you're skiing, what do you have to wear? Well, you got to wear eye shades, glasses, okay, to prevent your eyes getting damaged from the high reflection of the snow and the ice. So the Earth and its atmosphere reflects, and I think someone said that, maybe it was you, Jacob, early on, said that there's a percentage of the incoming radiation that is reflected off the atmosphere, okay? And folks, it turns out that the albedo of our planet is about 30%. What does that mean? It means that almost 1/3 of all the sun's energy that comes in and interacts with our planet doesn't do anything in terms of warming the planet, right? It's just reflected straight back into outer space, okay? And about 19% of the incoming radiation is absorbed by the atmosphere, right? So Irada, here's your comment here. This would be, for example, stratospheric ozone, right? Absorbing a large chunk of ultraviolet radiation, okay? And this is the perhaps surprising little number here. 50 to 51% of the sun's energy is absorbed at the Earth's surface. So half of the sun's energy never makes it to the Earth's surface. It's either absorbed by the atmosphere or it's reflected, right, through the albedo. About half of the sun's energy is actually used to warm up the Earth's surface, its terrestrial surface, and its oceans. Okay, cool. So how does that work? What does that 50% do? Well, it turns the Earth into a thermal source, right? The Earth starts warming up and the Earth starts emitting radiation. So this down here, right, all of this on the left-hand side refers to the sun spectrum that we've already covered in the previous diagram. There's all the shaded area. So this is the sun spectrum on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, this is the Earth spectrum that we've just talked about in the previous diagram. So how does the Earth spectrum work, right? Well, the Earth emits long-wave radiation, and some of that escapes directly into outer space through the atmospheric window. But this is the most important component of this entire diagram. Those gases, everybody, in the atmosphere, the water vapors, the carbon dioxides, the methanes, these gases absorb long-wave energy being given off by the Earth. And because they absorb that energy, those gases warm the atmosphere. Does that make sense to everybody? That's called the greenhouse effect. It's the effect of keeping our planetary temperatures much warmer than they otherwise would be. Now, I know one or two of you used the term trap, and that's okay. A lot of people think of it in terms of trapping energy. It doesn't really work like that, right? These greenhouse gases don't really act as a blanket. They don't even act as a greenhouse, but that's a whole nother issue. What I want you to think about are these gases in the atmosphere, right? Like carbon dioxide and water vapor will absorb energy given off by the Earth. And because they absorb energy, they begin to emit energy back towards the surface. So we get our heat energy, it turns out, from two sources, right? One is the sun. Well, sure, that's important, okay, right? So we get our energy from the sun. But in terms of climate, we also get a whole bunch of energy from the atmosphere. And that is the greenhouse effect, right? So if I go back just a second here to this previous diagram, okay? If there was no greenhouse effect, think about this. See if you can answer this question, you've got this entire concept. If there was no greenhouse effect, what would this curve on the right look like? Someone answer me that. If there was no greenhouse effect, what would that curve look like on the right-hand side? Someone tell me what that diagram looks like.
There wouldn't be any shade, correct?
If there was no greenhouse effect.
Yeah, if there's no greenhouse effect, there wouldn't be like a shaded area because it would all be emitted out, correct?
Almost correct. I see where you're headed. So think about this, Matt. Remember, the shaded area is the atmospheric window. That's the energy that is just simply escaping to outer space.
So it's the opposite. It would be all shaded.
Exactly. Perfect. It would be all shaded, right? So if there was no greenhouse effect, so you've got the concept, right? If there's no greenhouse effect, in other words, if there's no gases in the atmosphere selectively absorbing, all of this blue goes, all of the carbon dioxide goes, okay? And this entire curve under here, this entire thing is all shaded in blue and becomes one big atmospheric window. if there's no greenhouse effect, right? Now, let's flip that on its head, everybody. What happens if we start increasing the greenhouse effect? In other words, what happens if we start adding more water vapor, more carbon dioxide, more methane, okay? Then what happens? This atmospheric window begins to shrink, all right? And more of that stays absorbed in the atmosphere. Does that make sense to everybody? So the greenhouse effect, everyone, is absolutely fundamental to our climate, right? If we didn't have, some people think the greenhouse effect, well, that's a bad thing. Not at all. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't be here, right? And here is the bizarre, this may just seem really, really odd, okay? But if we did not have a greenhouse effect, in other words, if we did not have these gases in the atmosphere like carbon dioxide and water vapor, right? Our global temperature on average would be minus 18 degrees Celsius. That would be the Earth's average temperature without a greenhouse effect. In other words, take this away, take out the carbon dioxide, take out the water vapor, that's our global average temperatures. You don't have to worry about an exam tomorrow. Why? Because we're not here, okay? We put these selective gases into the atmosphere, our average global temperature changes to a positive 15 degrees Celsius. That's a 33 degrees Celsius swing in the global temperatures to what they theoretically should be to what they actually are, okay? Which is extraordinary. And that's brought about by just a few fractions of a percentage of gases like water vapor and carbon dioxide. Here's another way to think of it, everybody. We can look at the greenhouse effect on Earth, and we can look at the greenhouse effect on a planet like Venus, right? I hope this kind of clarifies, and then we'll move on. Let's just look at Venus for a second. So Venus is much closer to the sun, right? Venus, and I don't want you to remember these numbers, okay? But if we look at the amount of solar radiation striking the surface of Venus, the amount of solar radiation striking the surface of Venus, striking the top of the atmosphere, of Venus, is about 645 watts per square meter, okay? The Earth, it's about half that, because Venus is much closer to the sun. But Venus has an atmosphere that is 5 times thicker than the Earth. That's point number 1. And point number 2 is the atmosphere in Venus is about 96% carbon dioxide. Earth, 0.04%. So what does that mean? That means that a huge amount of the energy, virtually all of the energy, okay, that enters into the Venusian atmosphere stays in there as a greenhouse effect. The surface temperature of Venus is 460 degrees Celsius on average. The surface temperature of the Earth is 15 degrees Celsius on average, right? We have a greenhouse effect here in effect of 33 degrees Celsius, right? Remember, it should be minus 18, it's positive 50. The Venusian greenhouse effect is 285 degrees Celsius, okay? So that's a really critical point, I think. I always spend just a little bit of time going through that because that's a critical point to understand climate change, right? And that is that we have these gases like carbon dioxide and water vapor in such tiny quantities, and yet they keep our planet warm and livable. All right. That's the end of the sciencey bit. Let me stop there and see if there are any questions or comments, everybody. Does that make sense to everybody? I want you to be able to explain the greenhouse effect to me.
So basically the gist of it all is that we need the greenhouse effect to make our planet livable, but we also can't push the amount of that we're forcing the Earth to use and like push it into what we would call like the red zone, as far as then it would be the opposite. We'd have the opposite effect, correct? That's
right. Nicely put. Yeah, you know, those planetary boundaries we talked about right on at the first outset, right? So the greenhouse effect is fundamentally important. Without it, we're not here, okay? And it's a natural process. And those gases like CO2 and methane and water vapor are the gases that keep our planet livable, right? We really truly are this Goldilocks planet in terms of the composition of the atmosphere, our position from the sun, okay? And, you know, you look at Mars versus Venus, you know, these atmospheres are not livable. Why? Because they don't have a greenhouse effect. So nicely stated, Matt. The point here is we've got this greenhouse effect. Okay, it's not that it's static and stable throughout geologic time. We know that there's more carbon dioxide and less carbon dioxide over geologic time periods, and we can talk about that as well if we have time. But the point is that human time scale, right? The question is, what are we doing to change that natural balance of CO2 and other greenhouse gases? Because this is not fake news. This is absolutely not up for debate or discussion. We've known for centuries, okay, a couple of centuries, that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. And we've known from experimental work done in the 1800s that if you increase carbon dioxide, when I say experimental work, I mean in a lab, you increase carbon dioxide, you increase the temperature. Why? Because it's a greenhouse gas. Question here is, how is our planet responding to humans adding more and more of these greenhouse gases? Yeah, that's the crux of the matter, man. Any other thoughts or comments or questions? Okay, cool. All right. So let's move on. Let's talk then. Now that we've got I think the fundamentals, we've got the basics here. Let's talk about climate change and how these greenhouse gases impact climate. Remember, just as a reminder, we're going to use these terms climate change and global warming very specifically, right? Global warming refers to an acceleration of the greenhouse effect, right? Humans adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and turning up the global thermostat. Climate change is a broader term that looks at things like changes in precipitation and biodiversity and ecosystems and so on, right? Okay. Climate change. So if you do a Google search on global warming or climate change, it's been a while since I've actually done that. And I'm not suggesting that these are the first three images that you'll see, right? But if you do a Google search, what you will find are images like this. Certainly, you will see images of pollution pouring into the atmosphere from fossil fuels. You will invariably see images like we have on the bottom here, right? Houses being wiped out and flooding as a result of, you know, increased hurricanes and storm activity. And undoubtedly, you will see the ubiquitous polar bear clinging to ice floes, right? The polar bear, I think, has become the poster child for the climate debate. So let me just make a couple of comments here, and please, folks, chime in as we go through. I don't know what your experience here is. I don't think there's any doubt, right, that climate change / global warming, those two terms, are being increasingly portrayed in the media in sort of very dramatic, apocalyptic terms, right? I don't know if you agree with that. I don't know if that's your experience, but it is mine, right? It is. I see the media. You know, you'll have, a higher than normal wildfire season, or you'll have floods, or you'll have something going on, and invariably someone will link that to climate change as quote unquote evidence of climate change or global warming, right? So there's no doubt that the media continues to portray climate change as an issue in increasingly sort of devastating terms. I'm not sure that's helpful, to be honest. It may or may not be true, right? But I think this sort of dramatization of climate change as this huge externally imposed thing, something that we have to solve and fix and get a handle on immediately, I think there's a lot of things that get lost in that sort of conversation. Don't get me wrong. I'm not for a minute suggesting that climate change is not significant and important. I just think what is sometimes referred to as the mediarization of climate change is problematic. So that's one point, right? The science communication environment at the moment, maybe like a lot of things, is very, very polluted, okay? A lot of people get their news from a variety of different sources. And you've got to be very careful where you get your news from. So these are dated issues. These are a decade plus old now. The first two green issues of Vanity Fair, right? And I'm not showing this to make any point other than just look at the terminology, right? On the first one on the left, so you've got the four climate crusaders, right? There's Al Gore and George Clooney and RFK Jr. and Julia Roberts, and they're all sitting there in the sort of eco-green. But look at the verbiage here. Climate change, global warming is a threat graver than terrorism. How much of New York, Washington, and other American cities will be underwater? That seems pretty scary, right? And so to some people, they have a gut reaction to that. Oh my goodness, we're all going to drown, okay? On the other hand, I think at the other end of the spectrum, there are people that go, that's just gross media exaggeration, let's move on. Again, I'm not taking either side here. I'm just giving you a sense as to what I think is being portrayed in the media, right? On the right is Leo DiCaprio, right? Leonardo DiCaprio, good actor. I like Leo. He's done a lot of good environmental things. If anyone's going to save the baby polar bears at his feet, it's going to be Leonardo DiCaprio, right? So there's that kind of portrayal. These are also pretty dated. But here's Time magazine. Again, I want you to look at the wording here. This on the left one is the Global Warming Survival Guide. Oh my God. Now we've got a guide on how to survive global warming. 51 things you can do to make a difference. I'm going to do 51 things, to try and survive this. I don't think that's especially helpful. And we shouldn't be worried. We should be very, very worried, right? We're talking about Earth at a tipping point, how it threatens your health, and so on. The climate crusaders. Simply put, I think this verbiage and terminology it complicates things to me. That's just my opinion. Again, I don't know how each of you feel about that. I know that my personal experience is that I often get asked, right? I think I've alluded to this. I often get asked, do I believe in global warming? Do I believe in this global warming thing, right? Because it's the environmental issue that's right at the forefront of the media's attention, okay? And I'm always very wary about how I answer that, okay? Because I think the people that I hang out a lot with, right, the environmental group, the environmental lobby, would like to answer that by saying, well, of course I believe in global warming. I mean, how can you ask such a stupid question? And it's very tempting to answer a question like that, right? But that's extremely self-righteous because someone may just be interested and may genuinely not know. They may be sitting on the fence. Well, I've heard this and I've heard that, and I'm just interested in what you think, right? So it's very easy to kind of be self-righteous and take a stance that, yes, I believe in global warming. And if I was to say, absolutely, I believe in global warming, then maybe this is my guy, right? This, of course, is the former Vice President, Al Gore, who, I don't know if, have any of you seen an Inconvenient Truth? It's a little old now, but anybody seen An Inconvenient Truth? That documentary? Al Gore won the Academy Award for Best Documentary. Some people just get turned off, right? I don't want to sit down and watch a movie narrated and co-produced by Al Gore, right? With his hand on his heart, talking about climate change as he flies from city to city in his private jet, spewing out carbon dioxide, right? It's a divisive issue because, our politics very often align with those people who are espousing a particular viewpoint. So if I was to say, yeah, absolutely, I believe in global warming, I think it's real and I think we should do something about it, then that's the box that I'm put in. That's the pigeonhole that I'm put in. If I say, no, I don't believe in climate warming, I think it's a hoax, right? I think it's something that was invented by the Chinese to put American businesses on their back foot, then maybe this is your guy, right? We do know, I know this sounds political, but I have no issue talking about this because climate change and global warming is very much tied up in geopolitics at the moment. President Trump, some people said he was a climate denier, some people say he is a climate skeptic, but it was really hard to know where he stood, right, on an issue of climate change. I've seen some of his quotes where he said he believes climate change is real and humans are playing a role, and I've seen other quotes that say, the complete opposite. My point is that we and I have experienced getting put into one of these two boxes. And once you're in one of these two boxes nowadays, I think it's very difficult to continue the conversation. Guys, if you're interested in this kind of aspect of climate change, I highly recommend reading some work done by a Yale professor called Dan Kahan, and I'll send an email out with his link. He's done a lot of research on why there is such a bias, right, to the issue of climate change and global warming. And I think the crux of it, the take home of it is, and this is kind of his point, and I think a lot of people buy this, is that people tend to reinforce whatever position reinforces their connection with others, right? With others with whom you share important commitments. This sort of tribe, my tribe is the tribe that believes, quote unquote, believes in climate change and global warming, and therefore that's the bubble that I need to stay in, or vice versa. So I want to hear from you. I want you folks to talk a little bit here, just briefly, about your experiences. What do you find? And again, there's no right or wrong here, right? I'm not looking for all the pro-climate people or the climate deniers to step forward or stay in the background. What has your experience been in talking or being involved in any conversations about global warming and climate change? Do you find that it's a polluted environment? Do you find that it's difficult to have a kind of honest, transparent conversation about it? Or do you have any of you been sort of put into one of these two boxes or pigeonholes? Anybody got any thoughts on that?
I think the biggest misconception that goes with it is people assimilate weather with climate change.
Okay.
That if it's getting colder in certain areas that it hasn't been cold in a long time, that means that it's not a thing. When in reality, weather has nothing to do. That's a daily changeable thing.
Okay, so I'm really glad you made that point, Matt, and that's absolutely true. Fundamental difference between weather and climate. Yep. And it's very difficult. And I think, again, this is my opinion, I think it's irresponsible to just link one single thing with a phenomenon, whether it be climate change or whatever. And I'm going to talk about that a little later on when we come back from our break in terms of causation and correlation. So that's certainly an issue. Yeah. When we talk about global climates changing by another 2 degrees Celsius, I've heard so many people say, well, I can go home tonight and turn my thermostat up by 2 degrees Celsius and I wouldn't even notice it. Well, yeah, you probably wouldn't, right? Because you're working within your apartment and a 2 degree swing over a short period of time. When we're talking about the global climates changing by an average of 2 degrees Celsius, that is massively significant for places in the Arctic, for example. So I take your point, and it's a critical one, Matt. Anything else? Anybody raised the issue of climate change over the Thanksgiving table and had things thrown at them or not? Nobody. All quiet. No one's ever discussed climate change before around the dining room table.
I have an uncle that doesn't think it's real at all.
Say that again, Claire. Say it again.
I have an uncle who doesn't think it's real at all.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. I've got a number of extended family who do not think it's real at all. Yeah. So how do you answer that? Have you thought about, or do you just not even go there, Claire?
I've made attempts, but at the same time, it's one of those people that aren't going to really listen to your thoughts or whatever, I guess. But I mean, I don't know. I remember Bill Nye. Sorry, I know it's cheesy, but I remember him coming out too, being like, "It's time for y'all to grow up," the global warming's very real and this and that. But it's something that's debated in my family for sure.
Right. Yeah. And so and mine too, right? And so the question is, why is there such a debate? Why are we so polarized? Why is there so much? Why is there this kind of, I guess, lack of consensus? And I think here in the United States, more than most countries, in most of Europe, they're 2 decades beyond this conversation.
I think it plays back into the culture of our actual nation, and that we're very individualistic. And so we're not very much of a community bound. We're find your niche groups and make everything good for those niche groups instead of the collective as a whole. Whereas when you mention Europe, they're a very collective thought process of how does this benefit the community as a whole, not just me as an individual.
You know, it's such an interesting point, Matt. It's this kind of, and I think it, I mean, it touches on a lot of things here in this type of course, right? It's like, at what point, and you've mentioned this quite a bit over the last 2 weeks, this kind of inward-looking self-preservation aspect that we're hardwired to do, right? And how do we turn that around where people, you know, have to carry the greater good? Okay, where is a little bit of self-sacrifice to go, okay, climate change or this issue may not be impacting me here and now, but, you know, how do we manage that commons, I guess, without being quite so self-focused? If that makes sense. I don't know if I butchered that, but maybe I think that's what you're getting at, man.
Yeah, no, it's just about reevaluating like what is our long-term stance, and like what do we want to see as our lifetimes evolve. You know, the things that I wanted as a 21-year-old are definitely not the things that I want now as a 30-year-old.
Yeah.
And so, like, understanding the magnitude of like the decisions that we make right now and what those look like as they're pushed on the timeline and how much they can exponentially grow if not addressed.
Yeah, no, I agree. You know, and the other thing is, and let me just go on to the next slide here. The other thing that frustrates me, now this is just my opinion, and again, each of you are absolutely encouraged and welcome to give me your own perspective, is yes, when you look at the research, and this is a really interesting bit of research that was done by the Pew Research Center, who I think do some really good, truly independent work. This came out in 2019. It was a survey, a broad survey of US adults, and there were a number of environmental questions in there, right? What frustrates me is whilst there seems to be clearly a political, I don't want to say division, but there's a political bias to the issue of climate change. Okay? I very often talk to people and they say, well, all Republicans are anti-environment and all Democrats are pro-environment. All Republicans are deniers and all Democrats are believers. Right? I personally don't think that's true. And what has come out of the Pew Research Center, which I think is quite interesting, is whilst there is still a bias for whatever reason, maybe that is your worldview or your economic view of how the world works, okay? What is coming out here is a fairly rapid change on the views of those who identified in this research, at least, I should refer to this specific research, for those who identified as themselves as being Republican or leaning Republican, okay? So this question, the percent of US adults who think the federal government is doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change, apparently 90% of the respondents said, yeah, the government's doing too little. And those were those who identified themselves as Democrat or leaning Democrat. But when you look at those who identified themselves as Republican or leaning Republican, and you look at the breakdown of the generations, the younger generation, again, this is not my opinion, this is this research, right? Was that more than half of those who identified themselves as Republican or leaning Republican, the millennials and younger said absolutely, and the same with those who identified themselves as moderate or liberal conservatives, right? Among the leaning Republicans, that number is 65%. So my experience, and I can only honestly just tell you what my personal experience is within my extended family and friends, is that it's just getting really frustrating, right? That there's this perception, maybe it's perception overseas or whatever the case. Well, whilst they're acknowledging that there is a bias, that, you know, there is still, there's a growing a sort of sense of galvanizing around this concept and wanting to make a difference, wanting to change. Here's I'll just show you a second result from this, right? This is the second sort of very specific question on climate change. This was the percent of US adults who say human activity contributes to global climate change, right? So the blues are some and a great deal, and these sort of gray greens are not much to not much at all. So 79% of US adults surveyed in this research by Pew said that human activity contributes to global climate change. And when you look at how this breaks down along the political, as you would expect, right? The liberal Democrats were overwhelmingly, 96% saying, yeah, humans are to blame, right? But when you look at even those who identified as conservative Republicans, okay, conservative Republicans, that was more than 50% said, yep, humans are contributing either to some extent or to a great deal, right? And when you look at those who identified themselves as moderate to liberal Republicans, that number's up in the high 70s. So is that your experience? What do you folks think of that? Does this research kind of resonate in terms of your own experience on how people view climate change, or do you think this is perhaps misleading or a little biased? I'd be interested in what you folks think here.
I think it's very accurate to what I've seen just, in my own family anecdotally. This was actually one of the things, climate change and environmentalism was one of the things that changed my mom's perspective from a more conservative Republican, always voted Republican her whole life until last election. She understood climate change and how it intersected with social and she understood how that intersected with a lot of social issues, and it moved her over. And I have other family who didn't get moved over because they deny it. And I think this study also shows, it's like, why do more liberal leaning people believe that climate change is an issue? And I think it has to do with a lot of misinformation and what misinformation is spread, because misinformation is spread everywhere now. I think we're seeing now with COVID and with the environment that a lot of scientific misinformation does come from the Republican Party more so than the Democrat Party. Now, don't get me wrong, both parties spread their own bits and pieces of misinformation and have their own biases.
Yep.
I do think the Republican agenda, though, is more to deny climate and health stuff. So I think that's a really big indicator of why the poll looks like it does too.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, and this is quite controversial stuff, right? Because we're starting to move. And again, I really appreciate your comments, Jacob, and I appreciate the way you framed it. I think it's really important to be able to have these conversations and respect other people's opinions, because I've seen the other end of the spectrum. Again, just in my own extended family, someone who is very high up in the oil and gas industry, who says, I don't go to work every morning in my oil and gas company with a view to screwing up the environment. I don't, right? I'm in the energy business. My goal is to explore and to find resources that we can continue to develop and grow. And my worldviews align with, the red more than the blue. But he absolutely subscribes to the notion that human activity is contributing to global climate change, and that we would, it would only behoove us in the long run to begin to change our ways and move towards a reduced carbon future. But I take your points. Yeah. Anybody else? Matt.
I think there's a broad stroke that's given to the Republican Party that what you're going to actually find, especially in my age group of where we're at, is you have a lot of fiscally conservative people that when it comes to taxes and government implementation and stuff like that, we're conservative. But when it comes to actual social issues and that stuff, you're going to find a more moderate look at it. Like that's where I personally stand, is that I'm fiscally conservative. Yes, I will be fiscally conservative all day long, I would rather keep my money in my pocket as much as I possibly can, which I think when you get to the nuts and bolts of it, everybody would, if they like when they truly break it down. But when it comes to these issues, you find that we're more in the middle of how can we make a difference? How do we make an impact? So I think this broad stroke is brushed on both sides, that it's like, well, you're either one or the other. You can't be in between, or you can't have a differing opinion from the hard left or the hard right. And that's where I think our biggest divide comes from, is that we just automatically go one box to the other box, instead of seeing like, well, I can have a hard stance on this issue particularly, but I also can have a more moderate approach, or a more, even liberal approach to certain things.
Right.
And it's finding that mesh in between. And what you're seeing is that this younger generation of conservatives are actually, you're seeing them more move towards the middle when it comes to certain things like this. Whereas your older generation, in my family especially, are very hard pressed. But that doesn't mean that they believe that like none of this exists, or that they don't have a part to play in it. It's just that they have, that's the way that their world was shaped. And, trying to combat that sometimes is kind of almost a too of a daunting task. But the focus, I think, is that we're broad stroking way too much, instead of actually getting into the nuts and bolts of things. We just want to throw a label on and move on.
So I agree. And not only do I think we're broad stroking, I think what that's doing, it's pushing more of that middle towards the extremes, I think, because it seems nowadays, especially in this day and age where information is right there, right? It is, you're 10 seconds away from a tweet or something on Instagram. And I don't know about you folks, but I've never changed anyone's political views in a Facebook argument yet. I haven't. And yet that seems to be the way in which we're communicating. We're shouting. It's noise, it's misinformation, it's disinformation. I agree with you, man. My experience is that there's a whole bunch of red and blue in the middle. And funny enough, again, just in my experience, the vast majority of those people want very similar things, right? They want a healthy economy, they want safety for their kids, they want a clean environment, and so on, right? And maybe it's this polarization that has just kind of, I don't know, messed everything up. Very frustrating.
Can I also add on to Matthew's point?
Yeah.
It seems like when you say like being in the middle or being a moderate, is more people who would lean to the compromiser or whatnot. I don't want to say I take issue with that, but I have a different worldview. People can be in the middle on things, like when it's talking about the polarization of, let's say, issues like climate change, until it's time to put your money where your mouth is. I think what Matt said was like the nuts and bolts of things. So let's say if it came down, like if you're physically conservative and it was time to do an infrastructure in the United States where they were going to change infrastructure to more like a hybrid system. So they were going to reallocate money. Then at that point, what would you decide? You couldn't necessarily be a moderate then. You would then have to go ahead and pick and choose. Okay, either I'm going to go with it or I'm not going to go with it, which makes you on the left or the right. So at some point, I think like the polarization is kind of like inevitable, especially when you're talking about issues that are really pressing. You have to make a decision, especially if it's like for the long run. Which policy or which system are we going to use to implement for later down the road? You can't be in the middle forever. You have to make a decision. If that makes sense.
It does make sense, Ahmad. It does make sense to me, and that's why perhaps on a lot of issues you do see, the votes are very much, you'll have an issue come up, and the votes in Congress or the Senate, not surprisingly, they align with party lines, right? Maybe I think that's what you're getting at, that at some point when a vote is taken on a particular issue, right, you got to kind of go left or right, and make your decision. No, I totally get that. I just find it interesting that here is an issue, right, not just a scientific issue, because climate change is one of these kind of umbrella issues that is on so many things. Of course, energy and our well-being and all of these things. Here's an issue that for me really should be, apolitical, and maybe that's just naive. Maybe I'm just too much of an optimist and I simply am naive in that sense, but it should be apolitical, and we should be able to, come to an agreement on common sense policy about how to move this forward without sort of getting pushed further and further to the extremes. But I totally take your point, completely. Matt.
I think it should be apolitical too, but I would also say I'm a little naive in that sense. But it's like when you realize how much what influences things and what influences policy making, it's all about money in politics. Who can lobby what groups, who takes money from what lobby groups. And I think that's a really big player in where certain rhetoric comes from, especially in Texas. Growing up in Fort Worth, knowing people from oil and gas industry, understanding the political structure here. I'm a poli-sci major, and I'm very passionate about politics. I understand that the oil lobby in Texas is extremely, extremely influential to our political structure. Our politicians take money from oil companies, and our oil companies give their money to our politicians, and there's a very specific group that they give most of their money to. That's not to say no Democrats take money from oil and gas. They certainly do. But there's favoritism there. And it's who protects whose interests. The Republican Party is more likely to protect the interests of the oil and gas lobby. So the oil and gas lobby gives their money to the Republican Party.
No, I take your point completely, Jacob. And likewise, the Democratic Party will take, lobby money from the renewable space.
Right. And I think there's an important distinction to make when talking about economics, because every issue in the United States and in the world is intersectional to a degree. So economic policies influence social policies. The economic structure of a country influences the social, the social aspect of the country, social welfare of the country, I should say. So when Matt said he's fiscally conservative, fiscally conservative, socially liberal. I used to say that too. And I'm not saying it's wrong to say that, because that certainly is a valid viewpoint. But when I started realizing how much economics influence, aspects of social justice, it's hard to separate those lines, for me at least. And when I look at environmentalism, it becomes even harder to separate those lines. And I think we have a misconception in this country about what is the right, what is the left, and what is the center. When you look at liberal economics versus conservative economics in the US, certainly there's a difference, but in a large scope of all economic ideology, there's a small box that both fit into. And under the capitalistic system of the United States specifically, liberal versus conservative economics are both a conservative economic structure that just operate in slightly different ways in terms of taxes and resource allocation. And it's marginal differences that I think, for me personally, aren't big enough to
and perhaps and I do want to so thanks for that, Jacob, and perhaps that's sort of just the world we live in a capitalist society, right? Or in an economy that's driven by capitalism. So I take your points very well, and I think this is such an interesting. This is one of the things that we could, if we had the time, we could spend 3 or 4 sessions on, because I think it's absolutely critical in moving forward on how to deal with this issue. as we address climate change. Let me just make one final comment, and then we'll move on. I've got to make a quick phone call here during our break. But I personally am really encouraged to see, I don't know how to say this, to see more of a consensus, to see more of a convergence towards an acceptance that we're fundamentally changing the chemistry of the atmosphere, and that is playing out in terms of a broad range of responses, including global warming, including accelerating global temperatures. And I think, and I'm going to use this slide here just to kind of tie a bow on this first section this morning. I think it's very tempting, and I see this a lot. I see a lot of people in the kind of, let's just call it the blue space, blaming fossil fuels. I get that, right? They're anti-fossil fuels. They're anti. We don't want fracking. We don't want oil. We don't want anything, right? And there's no doubt that there's very clear evidence that a company like ExxonMobil in the 80s and 90s, and even into the 2000s, has been funding research that tries to perhaps minimize the impact of humans on climate change. But the big oil companies, the big energy companies, are absolutely, I think, 100% on board, right? You see what BP have done since the 1990s. Here's the CEO in 2014 of Royal Dutch Shell, right? Let me be very, very clear. Climate change is real, and it's a threat we want to act on. We're not aligning with the skeptics, right? These companies, when you go to BP and Exxon and Shell and other, energy companies, they've moved on dealing with climate change, adapting to climate change, mitigating against climate change, moving through the energy transition. There's no longer a denial train here. So I just wanted to throw that out there. That's my experience. I haven't worked a lot in the oil and gas space. I've done a lot, as I said, a fair amount of work in the renewable space and the wind space. But something like this sort of gives me, really gives me hope that this is an issue that I think we're going to be able to tackle here. Okay, let me just, so again, thanks everybody for your contributions. I think it's really important that we're able to chat about this. Let's take what is it? It should be 9 o'clock, yeah. Let's take a 10-minute break here, or a 12-minute break. We'll come back at 9:15. I've just got to make a call to my bank, as I've had some fraud on my ATM card. Someone seems to be having a lot of fun up at a Babies R Us in Vermont, I think. So I need to go and take care of that real quick, but we'll start at 9:15. We're going to talk about carbon and carbon dioxide. We are almost certainly not going to get right to the very end of climate. So let's see where we get, and then I'll make some specific comments about the exam tomorrow as to what will not be on the exam. Okay, so let me put this on pause. Okay, everybody, what are we? 9:13. Yeah, we're almost there. All right, so let's keep going. First stop here, as we now begin to look at carbon and temperature. Let's start with carbon, because carbon, CO2, so carbon in the form of gas, is the focus, right? It's not the only greenhouse gas. Of course, water vapor is, as you saw from the absorption curve, water vapor is a much more important greenhouse gas in the sense because there's more of it. But the amount of water vapor in the planet changes between phase, but it's there. It's not changing. What is changing is the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and so that's why we're going to focus on it. So this is the carbon cycle. Let me make this distinction here. So one thing that's really important, and if you've taken a look at the study guide, everybody, you'll see that it's on there. I need you to be able to be comfortable with the units in looking at carbon versus CO2. So let me just get that out of the way here for a second, because you're going to see some plots that have carbon, and you're going to see some diagrams that have CO2. Right, so carbon, the element carbon, okay, individually, carbon, if you look at the periodic table, carbon has an atomic mass of 12, right? That's the atomic mass of a carbon atom, okay? Oxygen the individual oxygen has an atomic mass of 16, right? And there are 2 of them. So when we're talking about the mass, the atomic mass of CO2, there are 2 oxygens, so that's 16 each, plus 12, right? So that is 44. 44 is the atomic mass of carbon dioxide. 12 is the atomic mass of just carbon, okay? So in other words, there is a ratio. If you take 44 divided by 12, what does that give you? That gives you 3.67. That is the ratio of carbon to carbon dioxide, or from carbon to when it's expressed in carbon dioxide. What I mean by that, everybody, and you may think, what on earth is he on? What I mean by that is that if I'm going to say there is 1 gigaton or 1 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere, that is the same as saying 3.67 gigatons or 3.67 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Does that make sense? That's important, because what we're going to see here and what we're going to start with is the carbon cycle, and it's the carbon cycle in billion tons, gigatons of carbon, just C. Okay. Okay. So this is the carbon cycle. This is my attempt to sort of draw an infographic at the carbon cycle. Anything in blue is natural. Anything in red is added by human beings. I'm not going to expect you to remember all of these numbers. I do want you to remember just a couple of important ones here, right? So the important point is this. All of this on the right-hand side here is the natural cycling of carbon, right? There is carbon emitted during respiration from soil organisms and from animals, and there's carbon sequestered out of the atmosphere by vegetation during photosynthesis, right? So 60 billion tons, balanced by 120 billion tons every year coming back into vegetation through photosynthesis, right? You don't have to worry about those numbers. There's 90 billion tons of carbon being cycled over the ocean surfaces, again, between respiration and photosynthesis in algae. There is an extra 2 billion tons, okay, 2 gigatons of carbon absorbed by the ocean surfaces. So the bottom line to all of the natural cycling, we're not going to worry about carbon being emitted in volcanic eruptions because it's very, very small. The bottom line to all of the natural cycling is that naturally, all of these processes take out about 2 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere each year, right? This here, 870 billion tons, that's about how much carbon is in the atmosphere naturally, right? This is where things get interesting, okay? The red. We are adding 11.5 billion tons of carbon every year through human activities. That's the bottom line. 11.5 billion tons of carbon is being added. Most of that is being added through the combustion of fossil fuels. So that 9.5 are things like energy, residential emissions, and so on, right? So that's the human emissions through the combustion of fossil fuels, right? We, of course, are adding carbon to the atmosphere, right, through our breathing. And we are adding carbon to the atmosphere through deforestation. So the carbon that is tied up in vegetation, when we cut down those trees and burn them or just cut them down, that carbon is added to the atmosphere through deforestation, which is the next topic we're going to look at. So the bottom line to all of this, everybody, is that when we add 9.5 billion tons of carbon through the emission of fossil fuels, and another 2 billion tons through human additions through respiration and deforestation, we're adding about 11.5 billion tons of carbon to the atmosphere every year, right? Does that make sense? 11.5 billion tons, okay? So when you take 11.5 billion tons and you multiply it by 3.67, we get about 42 gigatons or billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, right? So 11.5 is being added through human activities, and this 2 billion tons is being taken out, okay? In addition to what's by the processes going on over the surface of the planet. So the net amount of carbon being added comes back to about 9.5 billion tons. Any questions on that? The carbon cycle, and this, incidentally, everybody, is referred to as the short carbon cycle. The long carbon cycle is carbon that goes into sedimentary rocks and so on. So this is the carbon cycle that impacts humans. So we're adding, just through the combustion of fossil fuels, 9.5 billion tons of CO2. When we look at, so now we've changed the scale here. Now we're looking at CO2 in billion tons of CO2. That's why it goes 20s to 30s to 40s, right? We're not down at that 9.5 because we're multiplying carbon by 3.67. So this is really interesting. This shows the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, there's the financial crisis. We keep adding carbon dioxide. Here's COVID, right? We still don't have those final projections, but you can see when you look at the long-term trends of carbon dioxide, we have been adding about 3% per year during that first part of the 21st century. The next decade, our carbon emissions have gone down somewhat, right? Emissions have begun to slow down a little bit. And that, I think, is pretty good news. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's the 9.5 billion tons, or if you multiply that by 3.67, you get to the 35 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so it's interesting to see what the pandemic has done in terms of global emissions. All right, so let's start with this diagram here, okay? Because this is the diagram that certainly Vice President Gore started with in his Inconvenient Truth, and many people turn to this as the kind of baseline. What has carbon dioxide done coming out of World War II and into the Great Acceleration? So it turns out that the most reliable, most accurate measure or record of CO2, okay, comes out of Hawaii from the Mauna Loa Observatory. So these measurements were started back here in 1957, right? This is the most representative, I guess, data set of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now we're expressing this as parts per million, right? Parts per million. Remember when we started, we said carbon dioxide is 0.041%. That's the same as saying 410 parts per million, right? So we're using some scales interchangeably, and I want you to be comfortable with that. So what you're seeing here is the carbon dioxide record measured on Mauna Loa, right? The solid line here is the annual average, okay? And when you look at this record, you'll see that there's an up and down, up and down, up and down, right? Carbon dioxide goes through a seasonal trend, okay? And that seasonal trend is when vegetation grows and vegetation dies back. So in the winter, when vegetation begins to die back, carbon dioxide goes up a little bit as that carbon is emitted into the atmosphere. And during summer, when vegetation grows, carbon dioxide goes down because that vegetation stores that CO2 within the structures of the leaves. But it's the overall trend. So this trend here shows CO2 going from about 320 parts per million in 1958, and we are currently at the 2020 average is 415 parts per million. So it's an almost 50% increase in CO2 since the late 1950s. All good. Any questions on there? Okay. Okay, what's really important when we start looking at carbon and when we start looking at temperature is obviously this is a record just over the last 60 or so years, right? We need to go back and say, okay, that's a fairly short record, but we don't have satellites or instruments measuring carbon or temperature going back anywhere near 60 or so years. But can we say anything about what CO2 has done over a longer time period? So it turns out we can, right? And we can do that by drilling ice cores. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen any documentaries on this, but it's pretty cool. They've done this in Greenland and other parts of the world. They've done a lot of this on Antarctica, where you go down and you drill into an ice sheet, an ice core, where we know that the snow and the ice is building up over time, right? And then you can go in and you can extract the air bubbles out at various time periods. So here's CO2 in parts per million, okay? And these solid little diamonds here, this is the Mauna Loa record. You can see that on the legend here. MLO is the Mauna Loa record. So this is the carbon dioxide record on the top of Mauna Loa since 1958. So that's the previous diagram I've just shown you, right? And obviously this looks much steeper because now we're plotting it on a scale that includes 4 different ice cores going back basically 1,000 years, right? So this is the reconstruction of CO2 going back basically 1,000 years, okay? And there is now widespread, solid consensus and correlation here between the concentrations of carbon dioxide and ice cores taken from around the world. Okay? Many studies show this trend of not much, industrial revolution, great acceleration, right? This is often referred to as the hockey stick, right? Or the J curve in carbon dioxide concentrations. Incidentally, 1978 is just singled out here because the ice core data plots really well on top of the Mauna Loa record, right? So again, as we go back, that's the Mauna Loa record from 1958. This is the Mauna Loa record and the ice core data from Greenland going back 1,000 years. Turns out that they've drilled ice cores now in several locations in Antarctica, and we can go back and look at carbon dioxide concentrations going back almost 800,000 years. So this is presently where we are, and I've done that here in the little star on the top there, right? So can everybody, can everybody see that? We're at, it says 411, that was 2019, that's 415 parts per million. That's currently where we're at. And what you see here, everybody, is the CO2 record going back, well, not quite 1 million years, but 800 and something thousand years. And you can see that there are these cycles, right? There's this periodicity to the carbon dioxide record going back 800,000 plus years. There are periods here where carbon dioxide reaches the pre-industrial levels of about 280 parts per million, right? And there are times here where carbon dioxide reaches levels that get down to about 180 parts per million. And that's the variability of, that's the current sort of climate consensus, if you like, on the variability of carbon dioxide going back almost 1 million years, 800,000 years. We talk about carbon dioxide, incidentally, here as being phase locked, right? In other words, carbon dioxide going back 800,000 years seems to be locked in between 180 and 280 parts per million. And then clearly something changes here in the last 150 years, or to be more precise, about 100 years. Does that make sense to everybody? Let me stop there and see if there are any questions on the CO2 record, the carbon record. So this is really not very controversial, to be totally frank with you. We've got now measurements of carbon dioxide around the world. And I think even if you talk to sort of climate skeptics, they will acknowledge that we're in a different period in terms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, unequivocally. Makes perfect sense, right? We have unlocked the short-term carbon cycle here by burning fossil fuels. Not laying guilt or blame, it just is, right? That's what we built, the economic global development powerhouse that this planet has become, has been built off the back of fossil fuels. Matt.
To build off of like what Jacob said earlier about everything being economic based, do you feel like it's going to take a significant economic incentive to push into a more renewable space? Because I mean, obviously we all know, and if you don't know, like fossil fuels won't last forever. Like they're going to burn out, and we're going to have to find a different form. But do you think it's going to take a significant like financial incentive to get more people to come around to it versus like when I mentioned just proverbially keep kicking the can down the road?
Yeah, it's such a great question, you know, and I'm going to kick the can a little further for you, Matt. I just don't know, honestly, if it's going to require some major significant economic incentive, because there are already incentives, right, for renewables and tax incentives. And is that too little? Is that just incremental? And do we need something monumental? I don't think there will be something monumental just because of just how sort of tied in and committed we are to fossil fuels for decades to come, right? Which is the point we've made. I mean, it's changing. We're transitioning. Renewables are becoming more and more cost competitive. Wind already is on parity with natural gas. The fossil fuel industry wouldn't admit that, but that's just the hard, cold truth of it. And solar is almost there as well. So yeah, you're going to need incentives, right? Do we see those incentives at the same scale to get people to buy electric vehicles? I don't know. The question is scaling all of this up, right, to move into a newer transition. What I can say is I had a conversation with the chairman and CEO of a very large utility company not too long ago, smart guy, and we were talking about all of this. And I was asking him about just his viewpoint on we're changing administrations. What does the Biden administration mean for renewables relative to the previous administration and so on? And he said to me, you know what, Mike, the bottom line is nothing's going to change. Nothing's going to get done unless it is politically, economically, and environmentally sustainable, right? You've got to have those legs of this kind of stool, if you like, to move something forward. It's got to be politically sustainable, environmentally sustainable, got to be economically sustainable. And we're seeing that, but it's just, yeah, gosh, man, it's not going to happen overnight. That's for sure, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the severity of the problem has to be something that's, obtainable. Because like we saw, like the reason why I asked that is because we saw this huge incentive put into producing COVID-19 vaccines by these major companies and how quickly they were able to turn out a vaccine, whereas in a normal setting, vaccines take anywhere between 8 to 10 years to get to the market. Whereas we were able to put them together in 18 months. And a lot of it was predicated on the need, but also the incentive behind it, because Johnson & Johnson isn't going to do something that doesn't make them money. Right. So I think that's where kind of the crux comes into it. And like Ahmad said, like, put your money where your mouth is. Like, if this is really what we truly want and like what people believe in, then it's got to get to a point where it's such a overwhelmingly, I guess the word would be like negative to be on the opposite side of it, to where it kind of pushes like, I think this situation, for us to actually make a significant change, it does need to become polarized, and it needs to be significantly polarized to where people feel the pressure of the situation and know the severity of it. Because we don't, as all of our projections have shown, like 2050 could be a very, very bad time for us, and that's not very far away.
No, absolutely. It's not very far away. And overlying all of that, I think we do have to take a step back. That conversation, if we had that conversation, I see your hand, Jacob, I'll get you in a second. If we had that conversation just in the space of, say, the OECD, the G7 or the G20, that would be one thing. But then how do we address all of those issues when we're starting to talk about, developing countries that are still moving through, when you remember all of those bubbles in the Gapminder plots, right? Yeah, these developing countries are all moving very quickly towards the top right, if we think of that in terms of life expectancy and GDP, but they're still 20, 30, 40 years behind where we were at that particular juncture. Yeah, Jacob?
So I don't remember what Matt just said that specifically made me think of this. It was kind of like a light bulb moment. His question was about incentivizing a switch to more renewables. I think one way that could be achieved, and you could totally poo-poo this and say I'm wrong if it is, would de-incentivizing the use of fossil fuels through, I know there's a proposed carbon tax right now, through more carbon taxes, de-incentivizing the use of fossil fuels and the need to rely on fossil fuels.
Yeah.
In and of itself, not even no extra benefits gained by using renewables besides from the ones we already know, but de-incentivizing the use of fossil fuels to help transition to renewable.
Yeah, really, a really interesting point. And that has been not only controversial, but very difficult to implement because the carbon market is a mess, to be honest with you, Jacob. Yeah, Europe has a carbon market. You know, this idea of a carbon, you know, and we'll get to this towards the end. Well, clearly won't be today, but when we try and wrap this up, we'll be thinking about, okay, so if we subscribe to all of this, right, that carbon's going up, temperature's going up, things are getting worse, we need to do something about it, then what's the solution? Well, one of the two solutions on the table are exactly what you've said, Jacob. One is a carbon tax, right? Or two is what they call a cap and trade program, which where you set a certain limit on pollutants, okay, and then you trade those in an open market, right? So, Jacob, if you're the CEO of a company and you opt to pollute less, you can then sell your credits to, you know, say Bailey, who may want to pollute more and make more money, and you work under this incentivized program called a cap and trade. Both of them are controversial. You know, the carbon tax, boy, no one likes that word tax, right? And you come to a fossil fuel company and say, okay, we're going to put a price on carbon. That's what it comes down to. That has proven extremely difficult, right? Because the price of carbon is not stable. Exactly what should that price be? Some people say, well, we can put a price on carbon of $8 to $10 per, you know, ton. Other people say it should be $50 per ton because of all of the other associated costs with carbon, like human health and so on, right? So actually pricing carbon has been an enormously problematic and controversial topic. And the carbon market just has not performed very well as a kind of instrument in trying to deal with this. And I've spoken to people that have argued vociferously for both a carbon tax, and then also a cap and trade program, you know? So yes, the short answer to your question is that there are ways to disincentivize the use of carbon, but it's proven very, very difficult unless you have a country like China who has said they're going to take the lead and decarbonize by 2050, or probably more likely 2060.
Yeah. So if the carbon market is unstable, is that something that could or should be nationalized and federally ran, or is that something that's too difficult to do?
I think it's going to be the second, and I think you'll find you'll have such enormous pushback from industry on, you know, let's hand this over to the government to tax.
Just taking that out of it, like the pushback, just like on an objective level, like, is that something that, if it was done well, could be useful?
It could be. The question is if it could be done well. Yeah. Yep. No, it's a good point. Really good point. Interesting point. So that's a little bit about carbon, right, and CO2. And yeah, I think the crux here, as Matt liked to phrase it earlier, is that we have increased carbon by about 40%, right, prior to the Industrial Revolution. Again, it's not really rocket science. It's not really up for debate. What is controversial is the next slide, right? And that is, what has global temperature done? And then perhaps even more controversially, what we should do about it, right? So this is the big one. This is the, when I say big one, this is the probably the most controversial diagram. Just incidentally, I don't know if I updated this on the PDF, but I've just put a new little inset here that I'm going to refer to. So what are we looking at? So if carbon has gone up, if we are changing the carbon cycle, how has climate responded, if at all? What have global temperatures done? Okay. So here what you're looking at is the global temperature anomalies, right? In other words, for the entire planet, all of the data that is measuring global temperatures, and obviously as we go further back in time, there's fewer of those measurements and the resolution is a bit problematic. But we're looking at global temperature anomalies all plotted relative to the 20th century average. So that's horizontal line that crosses through zero there is the 20th century mean surface temperature. So anything above that line plots in red, means that the Earth was warmer than the long-term average, and anything in blue plots as a period that is colder than the long-term average, right? So what we have here is, if we just go back to 1900, we have this trend of warming temperatures. Now, it's not just a straight line. Hang on a second. Ah, it's only a drill. I thought this diagram was controversial.
Just a test. Just a test. It's always a test.
Ooh, geez, this is getting serious. A deadly climate change is a possible deadly situation. That's pretty good timing. Maybe I should have them do this every time we look at the global temperature trend. Hopefully this doesn't go on too long. Okay. I have. Hang on, everybody. Yeah. Uh-oh, this could go on for a while. Okay, when I'm talking, is this too annoying for me talking over this nonsense, or is that understandable?
I can't even hear it.
I can't hear it either.
You can't hear it? Okay, cool, good. All right, because my lights are flashing and all sorts of things in the room. Okay, so there's a period of warming here from 1900 up to about World War II, a period here where there's not much going on, and then a significant acceleration in the warming, right, following that. Here is the take home of all of this, everybody. When we look at the last, let's say 120 years, let's just take it from the turn of the century, 1900, okay? We've got global temperatures about minus 0.4 degrees cooler than it otherwise was. And now we're at temperatures that are up here at about 1 degree Celsius warmer. So for that 120-year period, global temperatures have gone up by about 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? In total. Thankfully, it stopped, okay? So that there, from right there to right there, has been about a 1.5 degree change over the 120 years. This little inset that I put here shows the latest average anomaly. So this is 2020. That's the latest anomaly for 2020. And we've got a warming of about 1.02 degrees Celsius. Does that make sense? Right? So here, when I add 2020 on here, it would be 1.02 degrees warmer than the 20th century average. Okay, so what this basically means is, when we look at global temperatures here, is that we have, over the last 120 or so years, incrementally changed the global thermostat, right? Temperatures are about 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer for that whole 120-year period. Another way to look at this, I thought this was a really interesting way to look at it. I know this only goes back to 2016, but I got permission from a Finnish meteorologist to use this. This plots the global temperatures anomalies. It's really kind of a neat way to do it. This shows the year 1900, and it's got 4 clusters of countries from A to Z, all the way around, right? And what you're looking at here is the 20th century average is now that ring. This is 2 degrees cooler, that's 2 degrees warmer, right? So now we're looking at this on a country basis. There's 1900, okay, here's 2016. 1900, 2016, right? That's pretty compelling, I think. That's pretty hard to argue, okay, of global temperatures anomalies. And just like carbon dioxide, I think we have to ask that question, what does this look like going further back than just 100 years? Well, it turns out when we look at a whole range of evidence, including ice cores and other lines of evidence that they refer to as proxy evidence, things like tree rings and so on, pollen records. This is just 2 studies looking at global temperatures going back 1,000 years relative to global temperatures over the last 120, right? This begins to emerge as a very compelling and convincing trend. Basically, that the last 120 or so years, is significantly warmer than previous. Okay. So that, what you're looking at here, is the so-called global warming signature, right? Pretty stable during the last 1,000 or so years, and then this ramping up during the Great Acceleration. Does that make sense to everybody in terms of global temperatures? Okay. Of course. Oh, and so when we look at the Mauna Loa record, oh, for goodness sake, it's going off again. When we look at the Mauna Loa record, right? Red is temperature anomaly, and the mustard is carbon dioxide, right? So the red is the temperature anomaly, and the mustard is carbon dioxide, okay? This here shows the correlation. If you remember your stats, a correlation closer to 1 is good, right? A correlation of 1 means there is a perfect relationship between the variables. So when you look at the correlation between global temperatures and carbon dioxide since 1960, right? Just looking at this record, there's a very strong correlation here between temperature anomaly and carbon dioxide. But I caution you, and I think this is only responsible to do this, I caution you that within science, we do have to think about correlation versus causation, right? Here's a very strong correlation. This may just seem silly, but here's a strong correlation between the annual consumption of oil imports, annual US crude oil on the left in billions of barrels, and the annual per capita consumption of chicken in pounds. Now you may look at this and go, what is going on here? This just seems silly. When you simply plot crude oil imports versus chicken consumption in the US, that has a really strong correlation, right? But that correlation is a spurious correlation. It's a meaningless correlation. Doesn't really mean anything, okay? I remember, Matt, you might appreciate this. I went to a conference in San Fran a few years ago, and someone was talking about correlations. And they had a correlation between the rates of asthma in Southern California and the number of strikeouts by left-handed pitchers at Coors Field in Denver. That correlation was 0.92. There's a really, really strong correlation between asthma and baseball strikeouts, which of course was meaningless and silly. What I'm not suggesting is that if we go back to this one, I'm not suggesting that this is a spurious correlation. All I'm suggesting is that you do have to look at correlation and causation pretty carefully, right? Okay, you know what, everyone? I'm going to stop there because the next slide, you know what, I'm not going to stop there. Give me just 1 second to finish this off. I think this is a logical place to finish. Give me just a minute or two. So if, right, apparently they just don't want me to teach today. Okay, so now this is not a drill apparently. All right, I am going to stop there, everybody. Let me stop there. This is getting a bit difficult to chat. So as far as the exam tomorrow, 2 quick things. One, we will only go up to this point. So we're not going to talk about observations on the ground, things like sea level rise and things like that. But please only go up to this section. And the second thing about the exam tomorrow is I'm going to be mobile. I'm in the field, but I will be on Zoom and logged on. I'll be there to answer questions, things like that, without any issues. All right, questions. Boy, sorry, I'm shouting here, but I can't hear myself think with this